You ready to? I'm going to start. Good afternoon. It's September 10th, 2025. We're calling to order the Unemployment Insurance Oversight Committee. House Chair Lord Charkoudian, here with Senate Chair Ben Kramer. And we're actually going to start. We have a few new people on the committee and folks who didn't know they were on the committee who recently found out they were on the committee. And the committee hasn't met in several years, so we're excited to be getting back on track. But we are going to start with just, and hopefully the tech folks can help us with this, just a quick introduction of who you are. Director Palma, right? If you want to start us off, and then we'll just go this way. Thank you.
And you can, oh, great. Yes, Jim Palma, Research Director, Maryland Department of Commerce.
Good afternoon, Mike O'Halloran, representing the National Federation of Independent Business in Maryland.
Rico Albuquerque with IBEW Local 24, the Electrical Workers Union.
Elizabeth Bobo representing Donna Edwards, Maryland State and DC AFL-CIO.
Kaylee Locklear, Maryland Retailers Alliance.
Grayson Wiggins, Maryland Chamber of Commerce.
Delegate David Fraser Hidalgo.
Delegate Chris Adams.
Senator Johnny Mounts for District 37.
Great, thank you. So folks should have received the agenda, and it should be posted, but I'll just quickly review what we're going to hear today. Well, thank you. We'll have our witnesses from the Department of Labor introduce themselves in just a moment. We did have our last meeting in July, so there were outstanding questions from that meeting, and we did receive answers to those questions in writing earlier last month, and we thank you for taking the time to put those answers together. We'll take a few minutes for you to go over those to the extent you want to, and if folks have other follow-up questions. And then there we have the unemployment insurance performance metrics and compliance both with the statutory and the settlement requirements. We'll get an update on the operational and staffing level changes, call center utilization. We're going to be discussing the overview of the statewide unemployment trends over the past 12 months, and then the findings from the work group on work search and the ghosting report that was submitted to the General Assembly earlier this year during the beginning of session. So that's our agenda for today, and we thank you for coming prepared. I think what we'll do is we'll go through each section, see if there's questions, and then on to the next section and take questions for that, if that works for you, Madam Secretary.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, if you want to start by just introducing who you have here, and then you can get started.
Thank you for having us. This is my first time appearing in this grandiose room here. It feels like I'm talking before the Supreme Court. It's pretty impressive. I'm joined by Assistant Secretary for UI, Rachel Torres, our Legislative Director, Andrew Filtoniti, and our UI Policy Director, Sabrina Steele. So I thought, in terms of the responses, a lot of these involve numbers and charts. So it's a little bit difficult to voice over, but I thought I would just sort of quickly run through them. And if anyone has any questions, obviously happy to answer. The first was on the historical data that Mr. O'Halloran asked for, and how have we done and the average high cost multiple over time. It's gone up and down very significantly. Often that has changed because of infusions, for example, during COVID, from assistance from the federal government, or other ways that we've gotten support from the federal government. We also provided another simulation or a projection based on a stronger economy, which is maintaining our current level of low unemployment, to add to those projections. So you have those charts available to you. I think it was Ms. Bobo asked about what other states have done in terms of changing their maximum weekly benefit. And we provided ranges for some other states in the region. Some other states, Pennsylvania and West Virginia, have a much higher maximum in the 600s. Others like DC, Delaware, and Virginia are closer to where we are in Maryland. I believe Delegate Adams, you also had a question about some prior funding that Maryland received when we last increased the maximum weekly benefit. We provided some background on that. I admit this was quite a while ago. It was in 2010. So I'm happy to try to provide more legwork and information on that. But we did provide that background. And then I don't know why. There was a question about sort of why did we kind of regularly increase benefits for a number of years, and then we appeared to stop about 15 years ago. I think we were not able to uncover anything to that effect, so I can't say exactly why that has changed. But, and we confirm that Maryland is currently 36th in the nation on the maximum weekly benefit amount. That was one of the questions we received. And then we also provided a chart showing the change in purchasing power since the last time benefits were increased in 2010. $1 today can only buy 68% on average of what it could in 2010. And so that means basically the value of the maximum weekly benefit has lost a significant portion of its buying power. I think we also provided some information about how that is looked for small businesses, as well as other projections about inflation. Then we produced like a number of tax tables and other tables, and I think also Ms. Locklear noted that she was going to have some additional questions for us on fraud and unemployment, so we'll have the opportunity to talk about those today. And there was also a query about how do we work with the comptroller's office regarding flow of payments coming into the trust fund and the comptroller's office. We do share information with the comptroller about, trying to identify situations where we may have both tax fraud and UI issues. So we do share some data on that, especially with audits. There were some other additional questions. We gave a pretty detailed response to question 12 on the jump from table B to C. I don't know if there's anything in particular, Delegate Charkoudian, you want to follow up on that. But I think those were all the questions. Are there any follow-ups?
Great. Thank you. Everyone should have received the document with all of that maybe a couple weeks ago. So if anyone didn't receive it and you want to get with staff after we wrap up today, we'll make sure that you get a copy of that. Does anyone have any questions for the Secretary on the follow-up questions from last time? Great. Well, thank you for the comprehensive answers to those questions. They're very helpful. Do you have the slides that you sent us? Are you able to connect?
Hopefully we can project them
Yeah, you should be able to.
here.
They're up on the computer. I'm not sure how they get up onto that. There we go.
There we go.
Not my forte.
Excellent.
Okay.
Is that what you're, yep, okay,
Okay.
great. The floor is yours again.
Okay. So want to talk through a couple of things, specifically how we're aligning operations to better serve Marylanders and protect UI funds. We're going to really talk about some of the key data we have and how we've been doing in terms of reviewing and processing claims and timeliness, and then talk a little bit about some of the challenges, solutions we're pursuing in our ongoing work to address fraud. Next slide. Keep going. So on data trends, next slide. So we really focused on filings, payment speed, and like how we're doing. So just to give you all some context, right now we have sort of a consistent low level of claims, especially compared to what we faced during pandemic. During pandemic, just to put this in context, we hit a peak of 539,000 claims in June 2021. We're now averaging, 10, 12,000 a month. Obviously, we don't know how this is going to look in the coming months. To take a closer look, we often get these questions about, okay, how are federal unemployment claims looking? This is a year-over-year comparison. 2024 is much more of a typical year. You usually only get a few dozen a month. You can see we're seeing much higher volumes now. That said, it's still a relatively small percentage of the overall unemployment insurance claims we're receiving in the department. This shows, and we touched on this briefly during the last hearing, because over time wages have increased and the weekly benefit amounts are related to the wages people are earning, as wages go up, over time the number of individuals receiving the maximum weekly benefit of $430 has started going up quite significantly. 2021 was a bit of an anomalous year because of pandemic and federal benefits and other things, but I think you can see over time we are seeing an increase in that, and over time that will have impacts for the trust fund insolvency. So I'm now going to talk for a second about timeliness. I know this is one of the things we wanted to discuss. This is a little bit complex because we have two sets of measures that we follow at the department. One of them is the first pay measure, which is under US DOL guidelines that everyone has to deal with, and that's that only refers to paid claims. Under litigation that Maryland Department of Labor was involved in I want to say, was that 21 and 22, there was a settlement that set a number of targets, and under the terms of that, and I guess I should say there was a settlement, and then there's also, I think we have statutory targets, that refers to all claims that are processed, and the goal there is to try to reach 92% of all claims being processed within 21 days. So they're similar, but not exactly the same. So wanted to push that out there, and then we'll look at each one in turn. Okay, so this is how we're doing under the federal Department of Labor metrics of timeliness. I will say Maryland had historically been one of the best performing states in this vein. We are not keeping up with even U.S. national averages now. The changeover to our systems, I think, as we're going to talk about in more detail, has really set us back. But we've obviously made tremendous improvements, and I want to credit Assistant Secretary Torres and her team for continuing to try to improve here. As you can see, there's also a national phenomenon of everyone struggling to make first pay timeliness at the same levels, and we'll go into more about what the factors are that everyone is experiencing this trend. These are the metrics under the GORA settlement. Again, we're getting close. We've gotten close to achieving this. We still, depending on the quarter, are falling a few points short, but we continue to try to make improvements to meet that goal. So I want to talk a little bit about the challenges, and I don't want to spend too much time looking back in the rearview mirror, but I want to acknowledge, and I'm sure you hear from constituents about frustrations of why does it take so long sometimes to address or process an unemployment insurance claim. So a number of you were here during the transition to Beacon, which admittedly was a rocky one. There were a lot of issues with the technology. I understand it was a very, it was a dramatic situation, and there were just many things that there wasn't time to really implement and test the technology in the way one would normally do because of the exigent circumstances. That said, a lot of those flaws really still have not fully been addressed. And what's happened is that, we know it creates a lot of frustration both for businesses and for workers. And it also meant we had so there's a technology problem, and then looking at the next slide, we experienced a resource problem. And so staffing, for example, there were reductions in staff over time, and those vacancies were not filled during the last administration. And then there were a number of other things that, for a host of reasons, were put to the side. And when this administration came in, when I came in, we had to go and find those issues and address them. So I'll take one example, which we addressed in the first 6 months when I got here in 2023. It turned out there were over 100,000 issues that had been created where people didn't respond to a request for identity verification. Most of them probably fraudulent, but we didn't really know, and they had been set to the side because people needed to deal with sort of the claims where people did respond. But we eventually have to deal with those, so we had to send out notices to over 100,000 claimants and say, we think you didn't respond, we think you may not be legitimate, let us know if there's a problem, we're going to deny you. And a small percentage of people came back, but we still had to deal with them. So even though the vast majority either weren't valid claims, like over 90%, or were fraudulent, we still had to take on that mountain of work, send out hundreds of thousands of pieces of correspondence, get that changed, and then also fix our underlying systems to make sure that didn't happen again. And so that's an example where the team did a good job. We have fixed that, but it's time-consuming and causes resources. Another I really want to talk about is a significant issue. Can you go back, Sabrina? I haven't finished this slide. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more in subsequent slides. It's an important issue about overpayments. So that's an overpayment of benefits. That can happen for a bunch of reasons. It could happen because we started paying the claim and then realized there was fraud. Someone said, this isn't me, something's happened. Once we find out there's an overpayment, we send a notice to the claimant, and they're supposed to pay us back. During the pandemic, the prior administration stopped overpayment recovery a number of times and for a number of reasons. Some of them obviously were due to the exigent financial circumstances, the incredibly high volume of workload. But the fact is that when we came in January 2023, overpayments had been turned off, and we were not pursuing them or trying to recover them. So we have to work to recover overpayments. That's legally mandated. It's also an incredibly important part of our responsibly stewarding the UI fund, state and federal funds. So we have been working to restart this process. In the fall of 2023, we started it on a forward-going basis, sort of like, let's turn the lights on now. But it meant there was also a significant amount of historical activity, stuff that happened before this administration came into place, that we had to go back. And we are still in the process of going back and addressing that work. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. I do want to emphasize it's an incredibly complex and labor-intensive set of tasks. Again, because the system was less than ideal, there's a lot to recover. The prior system was not maintained. So we don't have access to the MAB system that existed until 2020. So this is, it creates a lot of significant challenges. Compounding that, I will note that we were previously fortunate to receive a number of grant funds and competitive funds from the U.S. Department of Labor to try to improve and modernize our systems. But in this year, the Trump administration pulled back that money, so we lost about $25 million in funds to work to modernize our UI system. So let's talk a little bit more about what contributes to claim delays. These are a host of reasons. I don't need to go into them in detail. I think many of you experience them, especially working with constituents or supporting people. People have to submit valid ID. We get a lot of people who get tripped up on that first stage. Maybe it's just because they're not very good at using mobile devices. We've really tried to provide more in-person services to help people. We understand it can be a delay, but we have to make sure that we're checking for fraud. Then people have to continue to certify they're able and available to work, they've done the job search activities. We often sometimes have people who don't realize they have to keep doing that, so they have to go back, and we have to help them work through that. And often we have a number of days pass because employers need to respond. We need to ask employers to confirm, is this person someone who is working for you? Maybe the HR person changed, or maybe the employer didn't see the email, or like there are a host of reasons that it can be delayed, or they don't understand the importance of responding. And then, if for some reason what the employer and employee said don't line up, we have to go back and forth and try to resolve that and figure out what the facts really were. It's in an adjudication process. So that can contribute to claims not getting done by the 21-day deadline or whatever the deadlines are. It doesn't mean we don't continue to try to pursue them. It just means we're not able to always meet those standards or those deadlines. I'm sorry, Delia, I've been charging ahead. I think I was supposed to stop so you could ask questions.
Yes. Let's pause for questions. Do you want to call on people again? We can start with Mike.
No way. I defer to the delegate.
Oh, I didn't see. Oh, Delegate Frazier Hidalgo.
Thank you. First time, so if you've gone over this before and it's easier for you to chat offline so I don't waste everybody's time, please just say so. Page 5, when you, at the end on the right, when you say that federal claims have increased but are still a small percentage of total, we go from 28 to 467. Can you help me? Because for me, that sounds like a massive increase. What am I missing?
It is a massive increase compared to normal levels, but out of our total, of 12,000, it's still a small number. So I don't mean to downplay that it is significant compared to normal levels, but it's much smaller than our normal, than the overall population. And I will, as we note there, this doesn't include federal contractor claims. It doesn't include other people who might be impacted by changes in the federal government. For example, my organization had a grant. We lost it. Now I'm laid off. We are not counting those numbers. In the context.
Okay.
And I want to add one other thing. Of course, people file in the place where they are employed, not where they live. So for a lot of Marylanders who might commute and work in DC, they're actually filing in DC. They are not filing here. So that may be another reason that these numbers don't look as high. Individuals who are receiving severance, that would offset their UI. Many of those people may choose not to apply until after that severance or their work salary, whatever, bridge time they had runs out. So I think we expect that we could see some significant changes in these numbers in the coming months.
Okay, thank you. And on page 12, under staffing, has that been resolved now? Are you up to where you need to be? You talked about how there was a significant lack of staffing going into the pandemic, and now that we're in 2025, what does that look like now?
We have increased staffing numbers, and I want to express appreciation for the General Assembly, although I know there were personnel reductions, there were explicit protections for UI staff, I believe 125 PINs. That said, we are in the process of trying to figure out what is the right number, because frankly, we're just not nearly as timely as we would like to be. A huge part of that, and you saw the drop for everyone in all the states, claims have become more complex, and the prevalence of identity fraud is just something with the internet and deep fakes. It's just not something anyone had to deal with at this volume before a pandemic. And so it may be that the level of staffing that was appropriate then is not adequate now, or maybe different kinds of staff or staff dedicated to different tasks. We are in the process, and Assistant Secretary Torres has really led this to continue to try to ramp up the staffing. We'll talk a little bit more also, under the last administration, a lot of the call services were contracted out, and we've been trying to do some cost savings by bringing them back in. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that. But that does also mean more people. So for example, those were not PINs we had been covering before because we were handling with contract services. So even if we get the same number of PINs that we had before, we have to account for more services that we're now doing in-house again.
Okay, and a follow-up to that is, are you seeing or are you preparing for any fraudulent claims that are somehow AI involved, or is that a concern or something that you're following? Because I can imagine that's a challenge.
Yes, I'm going to get into that in a little more detail in the next section.
Okay, and then my last question, you mentioned that there were approximately 100,000 what you deemed as claims that were they didn't follow back up with. Out of those 100,000, you said that you reached back out, and what percentage were actually, you think may actually not be fraudulent, but might be real?
I can't say what percent were actually not fraudulent in the end, because sometimes
you are
even
now.
people who are fraudulent, but about 8% of people responded in some way to those initial
And some of
queries in
those might
2022.
still be fraudulent.
Exactly.
And some of them might not be. Okay.
Exactly.
So
And again,
it's-
these are backlog claims from years ago. It could be that, people moved, they moved on, they don't live in state anymore. There could be many reasons. I
They just
can't say
gave
they were
up
all
and
fraudulent.
ran away.
Right. But it was just, again, we need to close out those things, those kind of accumulated pieces of work that we're still hanging over from pandemic.
Okay, thank you for your indulgence, I appreciate it.
I'll be quick, sir. Thank you, and Madam Secretary, thank you to you and your team as always. It's, I guess the silver lining, I think, from the employer community about the department now, albeit it's a heavy lift, starting to reclaim some of those overpayments. Hopefully that goes a long way in terms of, providing more funds for the trust fund. But going back to, you know, to piggyback on the delegate's question about the slide 5 and the federal claims. To be sure, federal claims are handled differently, correct, than traditional private employers, in that the federal government reimburses dollar for dollar, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And then the next slide, slide 6, I'm curious, you know, actually, it just so happens NFIB released their Small Business Optimism Index today, albeit it's national numbers, but they said, you know, overall, I think it was 29% of small employers report raising their compensation. So I'm curious, you know, I see the number there for 2024, those hitting the weekly benefit amount, 59.22%. Is that, would you say that's because employers are raising their wages? Because that's kind of, it goes hand in hand. So that would be the reason why, correct?
Yes, I mean, Maryland's wages have gone up over time, and the wages, you know, is the basis for calculating the weekly benefit amount. So
Okay.
that's absolutely what would happen. What is challenging on the solvency side is if the amounts we're paying out keep going up because of things happening in the economy, but the tax and contributions tables are set by statute. So that's where you can end up with mismatches.
Understood. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Secretary, you brought up the issue of the grant funding and
Yes.
some difficulties. So, in 2021, I'm reading in ARPA, there was $2 billion nationally that was allocated for modernization of UI. So I guess my question goes to, number one, how much of that money did Maryland get? Because it looks like they did cut it down from $2 billion down to $1 billion. But the question goes to, of that money, how much did Maryland get? How much did we spend? And did we spend it on modernizing UI?
So, Delegate, there were a number of, overall, Maryland got about $25 million. $11 million of that was in the modernization grants. There was a series of other grants that also federal labor issued. Some of them focused on equity, some of them focused on plain language. We spent, I believe, and fraud prevention, I want to say we spent perhaps about $1 million of that money. We were supposed to have, I think, 3 to 5 years to spend it out, and then it was taken back. And that was true for every state. You know, many states received grants, and then they were taken back for other priorities.
So is it true that you spent the money and then it was clawed back, or are you saying this is money that you had available, but what you were not able to spend it?
So we spent some portion of that. That was not clawed back.
Okay.
But as you know, it takes time for us to enter into contracts, and so we were engaged on that route. We had not yet obligated or secured procurements for the vast majority of that money, and that money, which we had not yet spent, was taken away.
Okay, so the point of the concern that Maryland has, I suppose, is when I see these graphs, almost every state in the country probably has this appetite for modernizing and improving UI, and at least some of this is going to be technology related. And your testimony is that some of this money that could have been used towards modernization, at least temporarily, or as we're sitting here now, is not available to the state of Maryland. Yet it seems like we probably would benefit from that.
That's exactly right. Some states had not yet modernized. You know, Maryland was in a sort of interesting position. Some states were totally not modernized in 2020. And so many of them actually started a process in 21 or 22 and were able to use some of the funds for, you know, for that because they were pretty far along. For us, you know, we were trying to address our existing new system. We did see a number of improvements that we hope to make with this additional modernization money, but unfortunately it's been taken back. We are not going to stop. We're trying to use the processes we have. We'll try to see what AI can do to help us. We'll try to see what other sources of funding, try to use some of our UI administrative funding that we were able to secure in the last budget. But it obviously isn't at that level of resources.
Right, so it's safe to say Beacon came in during a very difficult time at best, and of course the state, as long as other states have not been able to catch up. But what I would say is that the state of Maryland probably would be wise to consider, okay, we can't get the money federally, but there would be a state imperative to improve for fraud use, for making sure the right claimants are getting the money, that is an investment that the state might want to take going into this legislative session.
Absolutely agree, Delegate. We would love to work with you on that. And, you know, part of the reason we wanted to have this time is to be able to answer your questions and acknowledge we've made improvements, but we need to do more and we need to do better. And frankly, as Delegate Fraser Hidalgo mentioned, that, the landscape is changing. Fraud is getting really sophisticated. Even in the time I've come on here, the fake employer problem was a new one we had not seen before. And with AI, things can be generated so incredibly quickly. We need to be constantly updating our systems to address those issues.
Mr. Wiggins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hi, Madam Secretary. Just two quick questions. I see a lot of reports out there about Maryland's, the percentage of claims that are fraudulent seem to be higher than 15%, according to some news reports from a couple of years ago. The number of fraudulent claims seems to be more than 1 million over, 4 or 5 year period. Do we have an idea of how many or what percentage of claims are fraudulent over the past few years, and how much money is out there and has been dispersed due to fraudulent claims, and I guess the impact that would have on the trust fund?
Let's do this, if you don't mind. Can we go through some of the next few slides about improving claimant experience, because there's also some stuff about recovering overpayment of funds and fraud as well, and so I can put those data pieces in front and then come back and see if those have answered your questions. Would that be all right?
Yeah.
Are
I'm just
there
gonna-
any other questions at the moment? Do you have a
Yep,
question?
I do. Thank you. So we're talking about the funds that Delegate Adams and Delegate Fraser Hidalgo referenced, and I just want to, we've also just, if you can speak for a minute, because I don't think it's in the slides coming up, we just passed authorization for a portion of the money that's collected to go towards administration, and unless you have it coming up, do you want to just speak to that now and how that will address some of the issues that you're raising and how it's going to be used, those kinds of things?
Exactly. Well, thank you for that question, Delegate. So there's a sort of, because UI is a federal-state partnership, there's sort of a formula by which the feds help us pay for administrative costs. Over time, that has gone down, and there have been more haircuts to it recently. UI, our state has been filling that gap with ARPA funds for the last few years, and that gap has been in excess of $20 million a year. Obviously, those ARPA funds are going away, and thank you to the General Assembly for including that small portion of a fee for administrative funding. We believe that should be able to cover the cost for this year. Again, because of the uncertainty about what the volume is going to look like on the federal side, we're not totally sure what will be needed, because even though the feds reimburse the UI claims themselves, the dollars, we still have to cover the services and administration as well as all the fraud detection. So we believe it will be adequate for that. And we hope we're also able to make some investments, even though they'll be more modest than before, on some of the most pressing modernization and fraud detection issues. Again, it's a little hard for us to say. The first year that fee will be collected will actually be next spring. So we'll have a better sense, but we'll also have a better sense by the end of this year and going into the next budget cycle of what our costs are looking like right now, and frankly, how fast the adjudicators are able to get through cases. We have brought on a number of new staff in the last 6 to 9 months to try to address the backlog and to speed processing, and we'll have a much better feel for how well that's going.
Thank you, Secretary. Secretary, quick question. You had mentioned, and I do recall the debacle of the Beacon system and what that brought about. You mentioned that not all the flaws have been addressed or fixed. Could you please share with us what it is that is still an issue and how it's going to be corrected at this point? And is this an issue with the vendor? What is it that is still outstanding with regard to the problems with Beacon?
Senator, that might be a longer conversation. I might highlight a few things. I don't know if Assistant Secretary Torres wants to add them. We were the only state in the nation that went with this vendor for both tax and benefits. And it's always tough to be the only client for a certain product, because it means you don't have as many options and as many resources to help support and improve. There are just a lot. Some of the things I'm aware of, for example, is there aren't data analytics built into the product. So every time I ask a question like, how are we doing on such and such, People have to write a new query, manually query the system, download things into Excel spreadsheets, and then they're trying to analyze them on the fly. Like, that is not something we would think is acceptable in a typical modern benefits any service platform, right? The analytics should be there. A dashboard should be something I can click and it will show up. We don't have things like that. We were several hundred PIRs backlogged. The last time I looked, it's really challenging to get some basic fixes done. And to be fair, during the pandemic, part of the challenge was the programs kept being changed. So every time you change the programs, you have to make adjustments in the system, and new programs came on. You know, FEMA did a program. We had short-term programs. We had totally federal programs. We had state programs. So it was very challenging to kind of write and rewrite the code for all these structures. It did mean that a lot of things were sort of, okay, this is the solution for right now. We're holding it together with duct tape and bubble gum, but we didn't have a chance to do it in a more systematic way. So I think there's just a lot of more systematic changes that need to be made. Rachel, I don't know if you can summarize sort of some of the top line things we're most concerned about.
Absolutely, I'm happy to. Really, top line is just the interface between a claimant and the system. It was really developed using legalese rather than a user-friendly kind of understanding plain language. And we have a team together who's going through it all to see the entire flow of the system to determine what pinpoints that we can easily fix right now. As one perfect example of one of the biggest challenges.
Can the beacon system, in fact, be fixed? And, you know, how did it come to pass that we are the only state in the country utilizing and I know this predates your service, Madam Secretary, so if you don't know, certainly I understand, but are you aware how it came to pass that we are the only state utilizing this system for both? You indicated the taxing and the payouts, and are other states using this vendor for parts, you know, one piece of it or another, or can you just give us a little bit of commentary on that, please?
I was not here. I do know a few states were using them for tax. I believe most of those states are moving away from this vendor as well for that. I'm quite sure DC, for example, is our sort of backyard neighbor example, and they are replacing it with, or if they have not totally replaced it with something else. Certainly that's something that as part of the modernization process we would look at, is the adequacy of the vendor and whether something else is needed. We're sort of retrenching now, given resources, and I would say, you know, any effort like that, obviously in Maryland, takes a number of years to accomplish. So what we're trying to do is really dig in and figure out, okay, where are all the different pain points? What can we do with the system we have right now to really do our best to improve service? Understanding, Senator, we do want to, you know, we want to continue to ask those questions. Is this the right product, or is there something we could or should do differently? I don't have an answer for that right now, but that was part of the process, is we wanted to sort of do that deep dive. And we are working with some, there have been some universities, for example, that have teams that have worked with other states on unemployment insurance. We're asking them to come take a look at ours as well and see if we can get some learnings that way, and understand, you know, what are the best practices, and how can we improve.
Is the vendor even involved at this point in trying to make their system more functional?
We talk with them all the time, and I would say Assistant Secretary Torres has.
Worry, do they work with you?
I mean, they're still running our system, so.
Yes, we do. For lack of a better word, we're micromanaging the process and holding them accountable.
Last question that I have, Madam Secretary, you mentioned that the current administration just pulled $25 million in funds that were coming to the state, and what were those funds going to be utilized for? What was their purpose?
The largest chunk was for unemployment insurance modernization, and that was, you know, that was a federal initiative recognizing many states were in a system with, you know, a place where some of them were still on old mainframe systems for UI. Others were in a situation like ours where we maybe procured something quickly, but it wasn't as ideal as we would like. So the biggest chunk of that was for modernization. Other things were for things like equity, and that can be defined in a number of ways. We were focusing on especially plain language and trying to really make our tools more accessible. A lot of the systems I found have been written sort of for people who need to think about the legal requirements and how to process them, but an average person wouldn't know, like, which of these 6 boxes do I check when it says, why did you lose your job? Because I can't understand, like, what's the difference between terminated and laid off? Like, how do I know which one I was? Is that terminated for cause? Like, what are all these different things? What do they mean? And often a lot of our website, the language is very detailed in order to be specific, but we found that it was just really hard for people to understand and to navigate. So we'd like to do that. We'd also like to figure out if there are tools we can have to provide better assistance to our staff and adjudicators. Because often, right now the manuals are paper. They're printed out pieces of paper in each center over decades, like people just printed out different emails. So we need to do a systemic overhaul, put out clear guidance, and use digital tools so people can access them and look things up quickly instead of having to spend 2 years memorizing a book so they can understand how to adjudicate a claim.
Any other questions from the committee at the moment before we move on? Doesn't appear so, so back to you, Madam Secretary.
Thank you. Okay, part 3, solutions. I mentioned that I do want to say something about in-person support. I think I may have said this in the last hearing, I can't recall, but one of the first things I noticed in my first year coming to the department is there were these people coming to our lobby and then they were leaving, and I couldn't figure out what was happening. It turned out we were telling them to, if you had a problem with UI, scan this QR code on the wall so you could get an appointment with an Accenture agent who under federal law can't actually resolve your claim because merit staff has to work on it. So we were turning away hundreds of people who are coming to us for help in person. So we've turned that around. We have reinstated in-person services to help people. Just at our headquarters alone so far this year, we've had nearly 2,000 people walk in the door. We've also started having people in person at different American job centers who are more expert in UI to be able to resolve some of these issues. So far, again, you see like over 3,000 people at the different job center locations. I understand there are reasons that tech can help and call centers can speed service, but the fact of the matter is a lot of people are not computer comfortable or they run into more complex issues, and I firmly believe we have to serve Marylanders in person if that's what is needed to resolve these issues. It's more expensive and time consuming, it just is, but that's part of how we're dedicating our resources. I will note also part of the process over the past year has been bringing that call service in-house. It does mean we had to make a lot of changes, but we do think it'll lead to significant savings. And as you can see, we've fielded over 700,000 claimant calls and 50,000 employer calls this year. That is now being done with state staff. And really with no drop-off in service. And we only expect that to improve because we still have people on the phones who are pretty new. The Accenture people were very experienced. They had some really good people on their team, and I know a number of your offices relied on them too. We're trying to make sure that we continue that strong level of service. So this is Assistant Secretary Torres was referring to this. If you look at our website now, it's a lot of lines, like hundreds of lines in very small font, and you have to read through thousands of words to try to understand what am I supposed to do if I want to file. So we're in the process of doing a website overhaul, much more with a sort of what do I do on each step. I've gotten a question from a number of committee members saying, like, why can't I be like a pizza tracker? Like, why can't I understand? What do I do first? And what happens next? So we are trying to get there, at least with some of the easier things we can do in terms of websites and visibility. This is just some of our internal coordination, especially as the federal contractor issues and the federal agency issues rise to the fore. We are making sure that we centralize that processing, in part because sometimes agencies had sort of different kinds of things they were saying, or it's hard to reach with the reductions in federal staff. It may be difficult to reach or get a response from federal HR departments, so we are centralizing that processing. We've also been doing, on the workforce development side, a lot of outreach to impacted federal workers, so this is just some of the work we've done. It's been very successful. We're getting a lot of questions. We're having, thousands of people attend our workshops, watch the webinars, looking to the resources that we've put out there. I do think go back for a second, Sabrina. One of the challenges has been with some of the federal employees is getting response. Sometimes from the federal agencies there's been a lag. Okay, next slide. So I wanted to talk about the overpayments issue a little bit more. I think this was in response to maybe Grayson's question. The Hogan administration recovered already about $500 million in overpayments. Last month, we announced that we were able to recover over $520 million. Catching up on this backlog is critical to our stewardship of federal and state funds. I do want to note, though, that these funds are overwhelmingly COVID-era Federal CARES Act money. So when it's recovered federal money, it doesn't go back into our trust fund. It goes back to the feds. So like the first part that I talked about that was recovered on the Hogan administration, that was, I think, $470 million, something like that, that went back to the federal government because that was pandemic-era CARES money. On this most recent amount, we're doing the calculations, and we have to reconcile our records, but we believe that probably a huge amount of it also is federal money. There are other outstanding potential overclaimant claims out there. Over 90% of those were incurred before the start of this administration. We need to keep diligently working to fix that. We also, as I mentioned, in the fall of 2023, turned on, going forward, the overpayment process, and that is a lengthy process. It involves many notices and then rights to appeal, because that was part of what the department was not doing correctly before. We were not providing the right to appeal certain things. So, but that, we'll continue to work through those processes. We do find that, only a small portion of payments often are recovered. Part of the problem is, especially from those pandemic-era payments, because there was such significant fraud, recovery of those payments directly from individuals is probably going to be difficult. The two big amounts I just mentioned before were frozen by financial institutions because we used to pay things out through debit card, and they flagged, the financial institution as well as the department flagged, hey, there's something wrong or suspicious about these, so they were frozen, and so that's why we were able to have them in sort of a group like that. That's not going to be true with additional individual overpayment claims we're pursuing. Did that answer your question, Grayson?
Any questions? Oh, okay, yes.
Do you want to follow up on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I guess kind of a question as to what you indicated there. So you said most of the recovered funds are federal, I think.
Yeah.
Do we have an idea of how much state funding has been paid out due to fraudulent claims?
I'd have to go back and check. We have a couple other assessments now of potential fraud. I don't know that I have a dollar amount on there, but we can go back and do that analysis. I will say, again, because most of the money that came out during this high fraud time of 2020 to 2021, 22 was in those additional federal programs. And frankly, a lot of those at the start, they were put out so quickly that the ID verification requirements sort of came, after the fact, and then so we had to go back to try to figure out if we were meeting them. I think it's, still likely the vast majority is federal, but we can go back and check and see what portion we think might be state. For example, on the amount and the $520 million above, we're still doing that reconciliation right now. It's very complicated. It's, tens of thousands of accounts, so we need to go through and check each one by one.
That would be helpful, but just because I see on this, I think the slide we're getting to soon, that the percentage of claims that are ID'd as fraudulent is still 18% as of Q3 2025.
Yeah, so maybe we could go to that slide and talk about that.
And I know that.
Yeah.
And I know the department has been publishing the weekly metrics for fraud on its website. I know that got taken down recently because there was I think maybe an indication that it wasn't being presented in the most accurate way, which I completely understand, but we're just curious about how much of that state funding is being paid out. Whether it was, prior administration or not, I know you guys are doing a great job. Trust me, I fully believe you're doing a great job. I think we're just interested in how much of that state funding is getting paid out.
So I want to talk about this slide. This is not saying percent of claims that are paid out with fraud. This is percent of new claims where we flag and say, we think there's a potential fraud problem. And so the reason for this is to really demonstrate it's still a significant, it's not what it was during pandemic, but it is still a significant portion of our workload. Many of those people are released because often what happens, it's gotten a little less now, but especially in 23, people would say, we'd say, well, you can't, you're not eligible. You just had UI or you just did this other thing. And they'd say, what are you talking about? I never applied for unemployment insurance before, right? I mean, including many members of this body, I believe their names were taken and used in fraudulent UI claims. And so a part of that is, there's this inconsistency, or it may just be because we are screening very closely. If you've moved and maybe the addresses on 2 of your IDs don't match up, flag for potential fraud, because it could be someone falsely took your name and changed your address. So we have to verify ID on those people, and so they have to go through additional steps. That's what these numbers represent. They do not represent percentage of claims that are paid in a fraudulent manner. It's the percentage we are flagging and saying, you need to resolve this. Unfortunately, it really affects our timeliness related to the slides before, because if 15 to 20% of claimants are going to have to go to somewhere in person to get something validated or answer 4 or 5 questions or backs and forths, it slows things down. But Grayson, we can go through and we'll go back and take a look at what the state dollar numbers look like over prior things that we know are fraudulent, because it takes a while to adjudicate through that to figure out what happened.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Senator Mounts.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When we're talking about overpaid funds, now is there a distinction between overpayment and fraudulent payment? In other words, an individual or whatever is, fraudulently trying to be compensated versus the individual who is filing a claim legitimately, and then they receive over benefit than what they were supposed to receive. Are those two in the same? Are they different? Can you help me with that?
Thank you, Senator. I'll start parsing it out, and I'll look to my colleagues to correct me a little bit more. You're absolutely right. Overpayments could mean overpayments for any reason. And this is related to, it used to be when people talked about UI fraud, what they meant is you were getting benefits and then you did something like you went back to work, but you didn't tell us you'd started working again, and you kept collecting the UI checks and you shouldn't have done that. And so then we'd go back to you and say, look, you owe us that UI money back, right? You weren't eligible, or you weren't eligible for the full amount because you got a part-time job and you were getting some pay, so you got to give us part of it back. And that was often what people thought of as UI fraud and a source of a lot of traditional overpayments. Post-pandemic, what we found is we had a lot of identity fraud. So you weren't even who you said you were, or you weren't eligible at all, and you still collected those monies, and those definitely would say are also overpayments, but we would think of those as fraudulent overpayments, maybe because of stealing someone else's identity. I hope that's helpful. What am I missing, Andrew?
But those are lumped in the same category.
In all of them count as overpayments. So some of them may be, honest mistakes, or look, I had a direct deposit, I didn't realize I had to call you back, or I didn't realize these other earnings would be counted against me, it was going to change things, or just other reasons, and as well as fraudulent. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it's just jarring. I'm remembering many cases where individuals weren't able to get their benefits, and so they, in a timely manner, and it was months, even a year after when they were supposed to receive their benefits, somehow they found whatever to get by, but then they were waiting on their unemployment check because they were counting on that. Are there cases still pending on disputed amounts from that era of unemployment from the pandemic?
There could be, Senator. The frozen amounts are a good example. We had to freeze all those debit cards. Do we believe, they were flagged for fraud for a reason. They were not, sort of willy-nilly done. But that said, there could have been honest reasons there was a mistake or conflict. We do get a few cases every now and then every few weeks, and where we release those funds, we re-adjudicate them. If people come back, we will check, we will re-adjudicate them, we will release the funds, and that's, part of our ongoing process. We recognize, sadly, many people may have never heard back, and we don't know because they gave up, and that's unfortunate that we were not able to get to them. But
Are you ever in any situations where individuals were charged with receiving a benefit but never received a benefit? I know of one particular case where an individual had to pay taxes on benefits they received, however, they never received the benefits.
If an individual gets a 1099 like that, we really urge them to come to us immediately. We can clean up their record and get it undone, sort of, so to speak. That happened very frequently in the sort of immediately post-pandemic era. I mean, Andrew can probably speak to it more because he heard from many constituents. It was an issue, and we did go ahead and address it for people.
And we still see them going forward. So when tax season comes around, if you will get a 1099 if you received UI benefits, so we direct people to come to us. We have a team that has them complete some information, cleans up their record, issues them a new blank 1099. So if you do hear more of those stories, we continue to receive them due to the continued fraud. So we direct, like the Secretary said, we ask you to send them our way.
And then you have individuals that work on these cases?
Yes. Yeah, we have a team that works on it, unfortunately, because it's a recurring problem.
Thank you. Just a follow-up on some of the earlier questions. Of the, let's say in Q3 of 2025, that 18% of fraud, what is your accuracy level of flagging? Like if, like how precise are you if you're flagging, like you have here 18%, so out of that, are you 80% we got you, or are we like
I can't say offhand. I do know that our flags, it's a scale, right? So are you seeing, and this is, I actually just came from the National Conference of State Workforce Agencies, like we all use similar scales.
I'm sure there's a lot of different levels of what
yes,
is defined
there are
as,
definitely
"Oops,
multiple
we made a
flags.
mistake, you made a mistake, sorry," or like outright fraud.
What I can go find out is we are always releasing all the time people from people suspected of fraud. I just don't know the levels that get released at any given time. Rachel, I don't know if you,
Yeah, I'm happy to share some information related. So we earn a side of flagging. I think that's why this shows the workload, because they go through several steps. You log on, if you apply for a credit card, similarly you get, hey, here's a multiple choice of selecting which place you reside at one time. And if that doesn't go through, there's another step that the claimant has to go through. And if that doesn't go through, we'll flag it and they have to actually go in person to verify the identification. So I think we err more on the side of flagging than not. So the chances of someone, nothing's 100%, but I'm confident of the chance of someone going through, getting to that base is much less than before.
But Delegate, we can follow up on, how, because we release people basically from the fraud flag, so we can get those numbers from you.
Yeah, that would be great. I'd just be interested to know of every, 1,000 people or, to make the math easy, every 100 people you flag, how many of them get resolved through oops, and how many of them are actually people that are trying to game the system?
And we recognize,
parameters of that. So.
It can have a deterrent effect. We recognize that, right? People may get frustrated. It may be that it's not that they're not a legitimate claimant, but they're like, forget it. I managed to get a job. It's too much work. I don't have time. I can't get off my new job and go back and fix it. Like, we recognize there's some margin of error no matter which way.
And I know there's I'm asking for a fairly wide berth of parameters, but I'm just curious as to what that actually, how accurate are you?
Okay.
How good are you?
We'll work on it, Delegate. We'll get back to you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to piggyback a little bit on some of what's been said, because I think for all of us, addressing waste, fraud, and abuse is essential here when we're having conversations about solvency or raising rates. And to your point, Delegate, this is where that information that you all were publishing online, I think, becomes really important here. There was weekly data online that had recent fraud data, including the number of claims flagged for potential fraud. the number of claims determined to be fraudulent after review, and then the number of claims approved after review. And that, I think, is really essential for us when we're thinking about how much fraud is happening. So if we can get, and I don't know if the link is just broken.
No,
'cause-
it's not that. What happened is, and I apologize that we haven't restored it. I didn't realize that. We were reporting it as a cumulative number back to 2020. So people were getting confused and looking and saying, like, you have $3 billion of fraud. What's
Yeah,
going
it
on? And
was
it's
a
because we
lot.
were adding them all together ever since that time. So it was very misleading. So we're trying to break it out and provide it in a more meaningful way.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you.
I would just want to follow up and talk about this concept of fraud, because I think it does get confusing, and I think you've referenced this, and it's been referenced, but I just want to make sure we're all really clear that either all or the vast majority of the actual fraud, right? So you're tracking people who now can come in if they don't pass whatever those 3 tests are that are in your system, then come in with their ID and proof. And so there are people who we may lose there. But the vast majority of the fraud that we're talking about is identification theft, AI, crime rings, that kind of fraud, correct? Not somebody who is, was unemployed, gaming the system, individuals. And I think you talked a little bit about this, about overpayments and mistakes, but I just want to make sure that we're clear about that, because there's huge numbers of people who need the service, and we are acknowledging that we're willing to slow down their access to these benefits in order to make sure fraud's not occurring. So that's like a balancing act, I think. How much do we slow down that access? They have to show up with their ID in order to make sure we're not paying some AI, identity theft ring, over here, right? And so that is this balancing act. And so we've got to, make sure we're not wasting the funds in this trust fund, but we also need to make sure that people who need access to the benefits are getting access to the benefits. So I just want to, we could just talk about when we're saying fraud, like what are we actually talking about? I think that would be helpful.
Thank you, Delegate. And I can't say off the top of my head sort of the percentages, and I take that as a follow-up, as we need to try to break it out in a more granular way. For sure, during the pandemic, and frankly what caused a huge amount of the overhang was sort of crime rings, identity fraud, people unlawfully, accessing things or impersonating others. It continues to evolve, and it shows different forms. And actually, maybe we could go to the next slide, Sabrina. This is an example of what we're seeing with deepfakes, right? So people take a real person's ID, a real photo of that real person from their social media account, and it used to be the gold standard was have the person take a picture of themselves with their ID. That's the way to really match it up. Well, fraudsters have found a way around that. When they take those real pictures, they use an AI-generated hand to then hold the ID, and they apply that way. It's constantly evolving, but Delegate, you're absolutely right. I mean, we do need to think about how can we have checks to make sure we're not paying individuals who are deliberately defrauding the government, and understand, of course, for example, if you are a legitimate claimant, but for whatever reason you had an overpayment, we do provide ways of getting that money back, right? Like it can offset your future weeks, you can pay it back, an installment plan. Like there are ways. We understand things happen, and there can be reasons that people had overpayments, and our goal is just to try to get that money back to safeguard the fund and address that. And I will say we also are working on that on the employer side as well. I mean, it's important. We do have employers, and we audit to make sure that employers are paying the contributions they should, because if employers are not paying those contributions, that cost is just distributed to other businesses. So we definitely work on both sides to try to improve those rules and make sure people are compliant. But yes, again, this is an example. Another example that we dealt with about a year or two ago was the fake employer problem. People started quickly registering new employers, and then a bunch of fake people or stolen IDs under that employer, and then immediately filing for benefits. The system just had not been set up to catch that particular kind of fraud, because it wasn't something that normally happened in the real world. We'd say, okay, have you paid in? It could happen that you have a business and people are laid off quickly, and those people should get unemployment insurance. But unfortunately, that was a different kind of fraud that we also have had to, change the system to safeguard against. What's next slide? These are just some of the things that we're using. Sadly, things like, knowledge-based questions, a lot of those are purchasable on the dark web now, right? So your responses to, like, what was your mother-in-law's last name, and what are the 3 addresses you lived at, what are your prior phone numbers, a lot of that is acquirable right now on the web, and so we need to do this and are using other options. The federal government has been working and has supported this way you can verify yourself at a postal post office. So we make use of that. We're using other forms of ID verification. And then, of course, we have a team manually reviewing. A lot of what we see is often people get caught up and they sometimes have to go in person. So they come to us in person or go to a job center. Even if we don't have an expert there in UI, the job centers all have tablets where they can help people figure out how to get through the True ID. People may not have a smart device. They may not have, good internet. So the staff there can help them verify and address that in the job centers around the state. Next slide. Oh, we're on to ghosting. Maybe I should pause to see if there are any other questions or concerns on the fraud ID side.
And I apologize, I meant to weave this in with my prior questions, but what is our record on prosecuting fraudulent claims?
Let me check with my lawyer. I have all these rules about how the lawyers can't talk directly into the mic, so I'll do my best translation here. Obviously, we can pursue, civil, overpayment collections and things like that. But in the case of fraud, especially where there might be criminal prosecution, that's not something the department can do. So we have to refer that. We usually refer it to the feds, actually, and the Department of the Inspector General there. We have also, I know we've had actually a recent indictment, I want to say, maybe, in working with maybe one of the state's attorneys general. We have to refer those to law enforcement,
Yes.
essentially.
So it sounds like the answer is, yeah, there is prosecution.
Yes.
However, most of this is handled by the U.S. Attorney's Office.
Yes.
But the state of Maryland, the Attorney General is not pursuing these cases, or maybe this is a better question for the Attorney General's office. I don't mean to derail, but it's interesting with fraud being such an issue. You see it where the Attorney General's office can be very effective, and I was stalling.
Thank you. The AG has brought some criminal cases in this area as well as some civil cases. So yes, we do coordinate with them. And obviously, it can be difficult to find the evidence. We did have a case where certain individuals were able to somehow access a system and enter fraudulent entries. And for example, that we worked very closely with the feds on prosecuting.
Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, just a quick question. Thank you. Madam Secretary, is there a statute of limitations on getting money back, and/or is there a time limit for getting money out, where people might miss that time limit?
There are some statutes of limitations that apply. For example, if we didn't, there are some rules, for example, and this happened. If we didn't establish an overpayment within a certain period of time, like we never told you that you owed us money and years go by, like we can't go back later and say, oh, by the way, claimant, sorry, we paid this to you 4 years ago, but we never told you you shouldn't have gotten the money. Like we do run out of time. Eventually, there are different rules about how those time periods total. You're absolutely right. And that is part of our challenge here, coming back later to try to kind of reconstruct the record for a pandemic era. Like there will be some things that, frankly, it's either we simply can't do it under the law, or it's just not feasible because it's, under an old system that doesn't exist anymore and I don't have access to, and there's nothing I can do about that. But yeah, so we do have to be aware of those, and that's part of why it's important. It was really important for us to reestablish the overpayment notices going forward, because since we weren't doing it, that meant, and we weren't, I take that back, we weren't doing it, and then we weren't doing it lawfully in compliance with the due process requirements to provide the opportunity for a hearing. It meant that we weren't, eventually we would run out of the ability to pursue some of those claims. You're right.
Secretary Beck.
I think the last thing is to talk about the ghosting study. And, there was interest in this before. And one thing I want to highlight is the way work search is done has changed. It's really changed. And, we find with technology, these online portals, people are applying for hundreds of jobs at once. And now with AI, too, right? Like, people are sort of using these agents to apply as well as to screen. So you're seeing there's like sort of much less of this interpersonal interaction. That we looked at some studies in addition to the research we did directly for our report, and some of the HR and talent firms have observed that it happens on both sides. Sometimes hiring managers never get back to candidates. Many job postings may not actually be an active recruitment at that time, so people may be applying, but they don't realize, like, that's sort of an evergreen posting that they're leaving up with, no one's hiring at that moment. And then, interestingly, and this is anecdotal, we have found some things, studies from places like ZipRecruiter, for example, that have suggested that sometimes the people who may not show for an interview may be some of the most aggressive job seekers. It's because they're applying to so many places at once and they're pursuing so many opportunities at once. So, we'll continue to benchmark this and work on it. We did audit, I think, is this on the, here we go. We did do some benefits accuracy and measurement audit. We pulled together our audit data, and of nearly 700 employers, or 700 work search activities, about 60% couldn't be verified. And a lot of the time, it's because employers don't respond to us at all. And so it may be, I understand employers are busy. They're thinking, like, what is this? It's not essential for me, or I can't find it, or it was fine, I just don't have time. So we don't know what's behind that, but we often just don't hear back from employers when we try to verify work search activity. They can report any ghosting activities to us. I think it's challenging. I know some have raised the idea of trying to, institute some kind of requirement on individuals, or some kind of penalty if individuals don't show up for an interview, or, I'm sorry, I'm moving away from the mic, apologies. I think it's difficult for us to understand what that approach might look like. I mean, I would just say, first and foremost, having been both on the management side and the labor side, I think it's hard to believe that employers are going to want Maryland Department of Labor getting like further involved in their recruitment and hiring activities. I'm not sure and they're going to feel comfortable with that or wanting to have to do that. That said, we are available for employers to express concern about to us that, we don't believe these are valid work search activities, for example. This did not happen. We do have a way for employers to report that to us. So I hope that's helpful.
Ghosting questions? Ms. Locklear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Madam Secretary. So just really quickly here, because I have the study in front of me, and then I have the key findings in front of me too. And I'm flashing back to conversations with Andrew in the beginning and just hearing all of the technology conversations and how simple I thought this could be, where like the employer logs into the system and there's on the drop-down menu something there where they can report that person did not show up or whatever it was. And Andrew and I went back and forth, and it's not connected, in fact, right? Like this is far more complicated than I imagined. But I thought it was interesting because the recommendation from labor was that we could figure some sort of reporting mechanism on the UI website, right? So sorry, I am looking at the actively seeking work requirements study that occurred.
Yes, I mean, I think we said, look, we can look into it, right? If
Yeah.
employers want to report it to us, I think that's the question, though, is like, what are we going to do about that, right? Because,
Right.
you know, the UI does not require that a claimant show up to every interview they might get. It only requires that they keep really actively searching for work. And if they get, you know, an interview, a conflicting interview, or they get a job before that interview happens, they don't tell the employer, you know, they've still satisfied from a statutory perspective the obligation to look for work, and that's what I thought was so interesting, is that actually it's people who are most aggressively looking where some of this behavior does seem to manifest. I mean, we can certainly use our existing ombudsman process. I think that was our suggestion. If there are concerns and employers have concerns, look, I'm repeatedly having people say they search for work with me, and we're just not seeing that to be true. I do, you know, I'm curious. I know this came up through some different members of the General Assembly raising it, and obviously some of the associations. I'm curious whether people are still seeing this. I also think we have to acknowledge that, like, sort of as tools keep changing and job search tools, like, hopefully things will settle into a little bit of a better path, because it's a high volume for employers to have to deal with right now with all these online applications. And it's very frustrating for job search applicants too, right? Because they feel like they're thrown into a pool with 1,000 other people. They're thinking, how do I even know if I'm being considered? There's really no way for them to know, so they just are applying all over the place. And it does lead to a lot of noise in the system.
I mean, if I may, thank you. Thank you. If I may follow up here, and you all flagged this in the study too, but one of the reasons that employers may not be responding is they have no idea that that person then went off and said, hey, I showed up to the interview and they really didn't, or they submitted an application and they really didn't. Like, that's also flagged in the study, and I think is really valid, because the employer does have hundreds of applicants. You know, retail, we have high turnover, so we see a lot of applicants coming through. I do think there is value in creating some easier sort of process here by which an employer could report. And I'm looking at you, Andrew, because like in my brain, it was like, we're going to go in the system. And I went in the system too with one of my members to see what all of this looked like. And there isn't that reporting mechanism kind of built in there. So I think if there's something that we can do to make it easier for them to do that, like, we obviously are very interested in eliminating that type of abuse in the system. And it is by no means pervasive, or the majority of claimants, we understand that. We know why the system exists. But again, when we talk about solvency and increased tax rates, that's where we're really focused on some of these items.
I think we're happy to continue to look into that. I think we'd want to sit down and talk with some employers at greater length about how valuable they would find this, and like what they think would ultimately be achieved. Because our experience, especially now as applicants are applying to so many jobs, just the fact that you didn't show up on one, just from a UI benefits perspective, the fact that you didn't show up on one work search with the corresponding employer doesn't mean they couldn't prove, look, I sent my resume to 50 other places. So that's what's a little bit challenging in terms of determining UI eligibility. We couldn't, you know, we would then have to go back and be in a back and forth. Well, you didn't prove that one. What else could you have used to demonstrate whether or not you did work search that week?
If I'm the only other thing I was going to add is that, I mean, we've been talking about the complexity of the system as it exists already, and like, I think we took a really hard look at like how we could do this, and I think that's why the recommendation was like, if we're going to add something, like maybe give it to an ombudsman, it's more of a manual process. Anytime you add another layer to the system and to the check, it's difficult for claimants, it's difficult for employers, it's difficult for our staff. I think I recognize like self-attestation by people is a difficult thing, but we do use that in other places as well for employers for certain credits and things like that. So it's not a perfect system, but to add another level of complexity, I think you have to weigh that cost-benefit analysis, and it's very difficult to envision adding that additional layer given the difficulties of the system as it currently sits.
And I think employers do not want to be in a situation where we're saying, provide us your records about who has applied to you and what you've done with them or not. Like, I suspect they don't necessarily want to be in that position.
Delegate Adams, followed by Chair Charkoudian.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think I was the sponsor of the bill that we're talking about here a couple years ago, and I was happy to do that. Let me just say this. When the bill was introduced, unemployment insurance, and I'm not going to bloviate. I want to be able to get to a point and ask the question, but give me a minute here. During COVID, I think unemployment insurance changed. The benefits got richer, the duration that people could keep the insurance was longer, and so it invited, in my opinion, and this bill was seeking to determine whether or not people were using unemployment insurance for reasons that didn't really match why unemployment insurance exists. And the reason why I say that is I'm an employer, and I certainly ran a business prior to COVID, the pandemic. I know what unemployment insurance looked like in 2010, 2015. The limit of the benefit and the duration compels a person that's getting that benefit to get from job A to job B as quickly as they can. The money is not in the insurance product, it's in the finding the next job. That's where Maryland and every other state in the union offers unemployment insurance, is to help these folks get from point A to point B. During pandemic, I believe, and industry would back up the assertion, that the workers realized that amongst many different things that were happening in our country, unemployment insurance was one of the tools to enhance those benefits, and that's not what insurance for unemployment is about. So I'll get to my question, which is, you know, I'm on property and casualty insurance subcommittee. I'm not on unemployment insurance, but workers' comp. Health insurance, name the insurance product. It has to be actuarial sound. You have to be able to match how much is coming in and make it work for what's being paid out. And each of these insurance products that are out there have the rigor that relates to who's using it, better have a really good reason for using it. Show us how. If it's a doctor for health insurance, show us that you need the referral. You know, if it's the workers' compensation insurance, show us why through the proceedings that you need the partial permanent disability benefits that come. Here's the problem with unemployment insurance. The rigor comes from the department, because you, the department, whether it's, and I don't mean you, Secretary, I mean the department in general, has the obligation to make sure that people that are trying to access it understand that we're not here for the money for as long as you want to get it, but we're going to push back. We're going to make sure that you're, like you did in 2015 and 2010, that you're doing the work search requirements. Why do I know that? Because I know that those were the kind of interviews that were happening back then. During the pandemic, those interviews, if they are happening in more modern times, weren't simply happening. But I would argue that as we sit here today, that bill came in not necessarily to point a finger, at least that's not why I brought the bill. It was rather to say that the legislature should be very concerned about how much unemployment insurance is being utilized. Is it being utilized for the right reasons? And as a Department of Labor, are we making sure the people that are benefiting from unemployment insurance see this as a bridge between job A and job B, and not some enhanced version of, let me just say it, welfare, because that's not what unemployment insurance is. So my question more generally is, are we taking this approach that unemployment insurance has some rigor, and that we're asking the respondents, the people that are benefiting from this, to view it as temporary, limited, because we don't want you to stay on unemployment insurance so you can get the next job? Are we sending that right message to these folks that desperately need it, but they also desperately need to get to that next job?
Thank you, Delegate. I'll try to answer your question. I understand your point about the rigor around the uninsured, around the insured population. Looking at the root causes for overpayments, and again, as we discussed earlier, there are a whole bunch of reasons what's an overpayment, right? It could be fraud, it could be other issues. For Maryland, at least, and again, the data isn't perfect, but work search seems to be a relatively small portion of, when you go back and look at it, of what is leading to those overpayments. In other words, you shouldn't have gotten that payment because you didn't actually comply with the requirement for work search. Now, are we being rigorous enough with checking that? Absolutely. We're happy to engage in that conversation. I do think trying to understand and realizing, especially with the very modest benefits that Maryland has, like the biggest incentive, of course, for most people is to get back to a full-paying job, because they got to have it. No one is living and supporting a family on $430 a week before tax. So you're talking like $350, $360 after that. Like, it is just not doable in most parts of our state. So I think that trying to figure out, though, how can we make sure that we're getting the best information possible. And also, I will note that over time, and we can provide more information, just sending in resumes isn't the only kind of work search activity, right? The federal labor has really put an increasing emphasis on reemployment activities. So it's like people who are most at risk of exhausting benefits, they're supposed to come in, they're supposed to engage in workshops with us, we track them, we reach out to them to say like, hey, you need to participate in these other activities because we do not want people to stay out of work that long. The longer you're out, the harder it is to get a new job. Everybody knows that. So we really try to encourage people to, be aggressively and actively looking for work as well as participating in other things, trainings, resume review, all those kinds of things. But, happy to talk further, Delegate, about, I do think part of the reason this issue came up at the time, of course, that the job market was very, very tight. And so employers understandably had some frustration when they said, I'm having a lot of trouble finding people, and maybe people aren't showing up because they got a better offer. I myself experienced and I know others have as well. This person accepted, the next day they said, actually, I got something better, so I'm gone, right? So that happened to all of us. So I do think like figuring out how we can do that.
So let me just follow up on that, because if that's the case, then unemployment insurance utilization is going to be low. It's all anecdotal. The employers are worried about something that doesn't exist, but that would show up in the data where I'm generally at with this. And it's not to get into a political conversation, but let me just, we're not here for zero reason. I believe there's going to be some legislation that's going to try to enhance, encourage to grow the benefit to help people. And the only comment that I'll make, and you can respond if you wish, is that on the other side of that actuarial analysis, when we try to expand the benefit, I just think we need to remind ourselves what unemployment insurance is all about. This is not workers' comp. This isn't partial permanent disability. This is a very limited program designed to get people the help they need financially while they're quickly looking for other work. And it may not be the best equal job that they had that they lost. So there are plenty of jobs out there. I just want to make sure we don't turn unemployment insurance into something we had during the pandemic, which was something very much other than what unemployment insurance is and what it should be. So that's my only comment. Understood,
Delegate. And we're happy to provide some information as you all are thinking about that, about exactly what the requirements are on work search and those weekly employment activities. People, if you don't certify every single week, you got to go back in and do the proof of what you've done. And, we do, say you're not eligible for benefits that week if you didn't make the certification. And honestly, that's a very high number of the calls and complaints we get is what happened. And we say, well, you didn't come back in and certify. Like, you got to do it. So, thank you.
Thank you. I got a couple questions and additional thoughts. So I want to come back to the audit first, where I think it's the page before, 60% of employers did not respond. So if I understand what you did there, you actually did an audit where people said, I interviewed at Steve's Ice Cream, and you called Steve's Ice Cream and said, did Lorig interview at Steve's Ice Cream? That's what you did? That's what that was?
Yes, it's
Okay.
part of our regular routine process, weekly
Was
process.
that-
It's done weekly. It's a continuous process. We call employers, we take a sample.
So
and
you're
call
regularly auditing.
Yes.
So this idea that ghosting is happening, you have no idea, there's no check happening at all, is not accurate. It's not checking every single one, but you're doing random samples and you're checking on an ongoing basis. And the challenge, it sounds like, is employers not responding to tell you one way or the other. Okay. And then of the 40% of employers who do respond, how often do you have situations where, Lorig said she applied to Steve's Ice Cream and Steve's Ice Cream has no idea who Lorig is?
I will have to get back to you on the actual numbers. But those all this would be a cause for overpayment as well. This would be a reason, or we'd have someone be charged an overpayment. But I will have to get back to you on what that percentage is.
Employers take their responsibility and respond, there is a way to address that then and correct it. So is that so really what would need to happen if we're concerned that people are doing this is we would need employers responding so that you could fix it and hold people accountable, and is that correct?
Correct.
So we wouldn't necessarily want to keep people who need unemployment insurance benefits from getting access to these benefits for the possibility that this is happening when you have a system in place that's checking for it, and correcting things when the problems come up. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. I want to come back to Delegate Adams has asked a couple of questions about the point of unemployment insurance. So I just want to share like some of my thinking, which I actually think probably Delegate Adams is similar to yours about the reason we have unemployment insurance is while people are finding the next job, we don't want them to lose their homes. We don't want them to have to decide between rent and medication. We don't want their children to go to school hungry. We want them to be able to really function in that period between one job and the next. Is that like, would you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay, and is another, and I want to ask about, but there's a second one. I feel like there's two others that is worth talking about. One is the issue of job matching and good job matching. Like when an electrician loses their job, we don't necessarily want them to go work at Steve's Ice Cream for 2 weeks and then quit that job because they're actually looking for a job as an electrician, because that's not helpful to Steve's Ice Cream to have somebody for 2 weeks, train them up, and then lose them. So part of the goal is to have sufficient benefits so that people aren't so desperate they have to take something that's not a good fit for them or the employer, and then cause more inefficiencies in the job matching side of things. Is that like, I'm not necessarily asking you to agree with me, I'm just saying like in the field of like unemployment insurance theory and why we have it, is that like also considered part of why we have it?
And that is definitely one of the theories, is that a longer period of time can help people find the better fit.
Better fit for them and the employer?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And then the last one, and like I think there's some economic analysis that's related to the impact of levels of unemployment benefits and the recessional impacts or the countercyclical piece about what happens in a particular community to small businesses when there's not sufficient sort of money cycling through the economy, and part of the goal of unemployment insurance is to keep the money cycling in that economy so that the higher levels of unemployment don't then create a broader cyclical effect that creates more unemployment and businesses closing and so on. Is that also part of the theory?
It is, and I think the data bears out that individuals who are out of work and receiving unemployment benefits, like that money's pretty much spent immediately, right? And it is spent on daily necessities like food and gas and like sort of things that people must have every day.
Okay, so then I just want to talk about like the numbers that we're talking about. So if somebody right now, I mean, you were saying $430 a week, but what we are talking about, and Delegate Adams is correct, it's my bill, and I am bringing it back again. We're talking about, in my proposal, it was $750 a week. There's other proposals that are $630 a week, but let's just go with the high end, $730 a week. That's the equivalent of $18.75 an hour, which is the equivalent of $37,000 a year. When we're talking about maximum benefits, though, we'd actually be talking about people who maybe are earning $60,000 a year, $70,000 a year. The people who are getting the maximum benefits are people who are earning considerably more than that. So we're not talking about people who are earning minimum wage and suddenly get to shift over to unemployment and they're earning more. I mean, they're earning like half of what they were earning with an understanding that there's a minimum and a maximum, correct? Or can you talk through that piece of it? Because I think
the maximum benefit is related to earnings, so it's people who are making more who are more likely to get the maximum benefit.
Inevitably, they're going to be earning much less than they were earning before they went on to unemployment insurance.
Yes, I mean, I can't remember exactly how the scales would line up, but for sure, unemployment is only a percentage replacement.
I feel like there's some confusion because during the pandemic, there were so many supplemental benefits. And I'll avoid my thoughts on what we should or shouldn't have done during the pandemic because I don't think that's as helpful. But I do think that's created confusion because I think there were some individuals who were earning more during the pandemic than they would have under normal times. And I think that's created confusion that somehow it's a good deal to be on unemployment insurance, even with these proposed numbers that we're talking about. And I just think it's worth noting that people are still getting considerably less, roughly half of what they were earning when they were working in whatever full-time job they were coming from.
This pandemic there were a series of plus-ups, and there were sort of flat dollar amounts in many cases, so it didn't matter how much you were earning in whatever job you had. That was an unusual case. It's not how typical unemployment insurance works.
Thank you.
And I think we just had a preview of what this legislative session is going to entail. Delegate Fraser Hidalgo, I saw you were next.
I'm good.
Your question's been answered. All right, we've got Ms. Bobo, I believe.
Yes. Just on the ghosting study, I know that we look a lot at interviewees being the one that are ghosting employers, but are we looking at it in the flip side of employers ghosting interviewees?
We do see that, at least we've seen, from some of our research that does seem to happen. I mean, different people have different understandings of what ghosting means, but that does happen to workers as well. I thought I had an interview and then I never heard back, or, things do happen on the other side. I do think sort of the volume and online nature of job search has just really changed how all of this works. And I do want to underscore one thing that Assistant Secretary Torres said, which is, we are constantly checking, and I think that's why we think something like an ombudsman process where if an employer thinks there's a concern, they can raise it, and we can do some sort of targeted, fold that into our regular auditing process, as opposed to we're asking every, building a whole system-wide thing where all employers would have to, or, be able to put in all these kinds of inputs. I think that is much more cumbersome, and we think it's, maybe some targeted investigation would be more fruitful. But we're happy to also think about where else do we find there are issues. Again, the employer, UI doesn't place any obligation on employers to do anything with respect to job activities. It only places that on claimants. And so, the only thing we can really look at with respect to the UI situation is did the claimant engage in the job search activities they were required to do. As difficult as it may be when employers don't follow through on a job, potential offer or whatever, that's not part of the UI eligibility calculus.
Thank you.
I saw Delegate Adams maybe has a rebuttal.
No rebuttal. I'm just waiting for C.T. Wilson to come in from up there and referee. Let me just say, as an employer, I'm on Economic Matters Committee, and we have an interest, and that interest is aligned between Delegate Charkoudian and myself, which is employees are the most important asset to any company, any organization. I mean, that goes without saying. And all I was saying by being a little bit long-winded through this exercise is we now know that there's a bill coming. I was not 100% sure, but here we are, is that unemployment insurance, whether it's Chris's definition or Lorig's definition, it's still unemployment insurance. And I'm just asking as we move forward in this process that we retain the essential element of unemployment insurance, which is that you got to get from job A to job B as quickly as possible. That's all I'm saying. Thank you very much.
Do I see any other questions? Yes, please, jump on in there.
Thank you. No? Okay. Just a quick question. I was fit into this topic of ghosting and getting people into new jobs?
Well, I think they are not necessarily directly related to ghosting. They are, of course, a pivotal player in terms of the reemployment services that individuals are supposed to engage in, especially people at risk of exhausting their unemployment insurance benefits. So those are provided through Job Center staff. They provide those workshops. Individuals are expected to attend them, and if you do not attend a workshop that you were signed up for, that is noted against you, and your weekly certification is a problem. So it's not as though, those are the things we can control, and we check, and people have to do that. So that said, also, we very much encourage people to go to job centers to engage in work search. And even though I know in the past maybe people thought, well, we don't want to be known as like the unemployment insurance center, like that's not what we're about. I actually think it's really important, and the ID verification, although I'm sorry that the tech tools are causing problems for people, I see it as an opportunity. Because you have thousands of people going into job centers saying, I'm having some trouble working on this, figuring out how to match my ID on this device, or I don't have a tablet, I don't know how to do this. that's an opportunity, because if you've helped them, then that's the opportunity of a job center staff to say, okay, this isn't just about helping verify you for UI. You came all the way in here. Now let's talk about how we can help you find a job and a better job, right? That is a moment of opportunity, and that's why I do think that in-person interaction is worth a lot, because I understand people are, you're at a tough time in your life. You are just trying to get through. You're just trying to make that next bill. Maybe you think you don't have the bandwidth to be able to engage, or you're demoralized in your search because you can't find things. But that's often where that in-person human contact and encouragement can make a really big difference.
One point of clarification. So my understanding is that your weekly benefit amount is based on the high quarter from your base pay period, or whatever you want to refer to that as. So just because there was an indication that Delegate Charkoudian's question was correct, my understanding is that using her example of $730 a week, if you were to have earned a high quarter but not earn that every quarter, there are very real situations where the UI benefit in that situation would be higher than the amount the worker earned. Is that accurate?
I mean, I'd have to go back and look exactly how those calculations were run under her bill. It is, it is a different formula that typically I think would not happen under current laws, but we'd have to go
right, but
back
under
and
the
look,
example given, yeah. Thanks.
It also depends on the minimum benefit, right? Like, because even if you fall on the scale right now, the minimum benefit is what? Are we at 50? I mean, it's such a small amount that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be brief, and this is probably more a request, maybe either to the department or the chairs. Assuming there will be another meeting of this committee, in the near future. The House Chair Delegate Charkoudian brought up, the idea of making sure that employees don't take a job just to take a job because, to use her example, an electrician doesn't want to go work at, was it Steve's ice cream shop? I prefer Mike's ice cream shop, but Steve's ice cream shop, and I think employers also understand that as well. I don't know how prevalent that is. I doubt very much the department kind of tracks that data, but I remember, and I think it was during the pandemic, there was a lot of attention, and I think even legislation passed regarding the state's work share program. And I think it would do this committee some good to hear more about the work share program. I know it may not necessarily help for employees that are completely laid off, but talk about the department's partial unemployment insurance programs and what that looks like, and perhaps there is. There could be middle ground, not that we're adversaries always, but between employers and those job seekers to try and figure out, maybe we need to improve this program, make some tweaks and changes there. Because I think employers would agree, look, we don't want, an electrician coming to, work in my ice cream shop, albeit, look, at the end of the day, and this is, maybe I'm going a little off script here, and this isn't necessarily a question, but it's just, I think employers may say, look, we need employees, right? Whether you're an electrician, an accountant, or you're just, a teenager. If we need employees, we'll take the employees no matter who they are. But I do think it would do this committee some good to hear about the work share program, perhaps ways we can improve it.
I would love to do that. Maryland does not have a very high uptake of work share at all. I was surprised when I came into the job. And I do think it's a huge opportunity, especially because helping employers understand what valuable opportunity work share can be when you do sometimes have to downsize. And I think there are a lot of employers in Maryland who found themselves very suddenly in that situation, especially those who have dependent on federal grants or other streams, but they don't want to lose that valued employee. And they think, well, I might get something or a contract maybe 3 months from now. I don't want my workforce to be totally gone. So work share is a great way to sort of spread the pain, keep employees on payroll and maybe on benefits for a while, with providing some assistance from UI. It's not well used in Maryland, and we haven't been able to get to the bottom of that, but would really welcome engagement with this committee about that because I think it's a valuable tool.
Thank you. I wanted to clarify one thing. First of all, I worked at Steve's Ice Cream for 4 years. Just thought folks should know. But more importantly, and there's nothing wrong with electricians who want to work at ice cream stores either. But there is actually economic literature that talks about the efficiency of matching. And it's fine for electricians to work at ice cream stores, but if they're going to take that job for 1 week or 2 weeks, it is not efficient for employers to have people take jobs for 1 week or 2 weeks, get trained up and leave, and someone else comes in. And there's economic literature published on that topic. That's the point I'm trying to make. Not that an employer wouldn't want an electrician there, an electrician wouldn't want the ice cream store, but this idea of job matching being more efficient if people are not desperate and have to take the first thing while they're still looking for something else. That's the broader point that I was trying to make. Maybe we'll do a briefing sometime about that literature.
And Delegate, it sounds like I should invite you at our next employee morale ice cream event to come scoop with me. So
I'm really good at scooping, the mix-ins, I did all of it.
Any other questions, comments from any members of the committee at the moment? All right, seeing none, I will turn it back to Chair Charkoudian.
So this was our second. We had 2 oversight committees scheduled this interim. So we're actually done with the issues that we had said we were going to address. If there is something else that people feel strongly about addressing, or if, Madam Secretary, if your team feels that we need to be considering something as an oversight committee before the standing committees take up the policy issues, feel free to reach out to Chair Kramer or myself, and that can be arranged. Otherwise, we'll sort of see some of these conversations play out in the policy committees once we get to the legislative session. So thank you all for taking the time to be here, and thank you to you and your team, Madam Secretary.
thank you.